April 13th, 1970. While most Americans are enjoying their morning coffee, we men are undertaking the most daring expedition humanity has ever faced. They're flying to the moon. It should be basic routine, and at this point, NASA has already landed 2 manned modules on the moon, Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. But no one could have foreseen what would come next. Routine turns into fear. The crew of Apollo 13 find themselves closer to death than returning home. And on this fateful day, space exploration was changed forever.
T-minus 20 seconds, T-minus 20 seconds, and counting. 17, guidance release, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have committed.
On September 12, 1962, President John F. Kennedy delivered a legendary speech at Rice University in Houston, Texas.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The crowd roared in delight upon hearing the president's words. The idea of mankind setting a foot upon the moon sent ripples of excitement throughout the nation. That it could very well be American boots laying the crucial first step was even more tantalizing. Not only that, but the United States was locked in an ideological battle with its longtime rival, the Soviet Union. Both nations looked for ways to demonstrate technological superiority, and spaceflight was a perfect avenue to show the world just how far capitalist or communist economic system could take humanity.
Впервые в истории человек с планеты Земля, наш советский человек, на корабле, созданном руками советских ученых, вырвался в космические выси и совершил первый рейс к звездам.
It was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union dealt the first blow on 12th of April, 1961. When Yuri Gagarin became the first man to enter space. While it was certainly a historic achievement, this didn't mark the end of the space race. Americans were eager to push through boundaries even further, and many saw the journey to the moon as the ultimate prize. The Apollo program launched, sending both unmanned and manned missions to orbit and the moon. Finally, in 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin of Apollo 11 successfully landed on the moon, planted the Star-Spangled Banner, and returned home as heroes. Americans were ecstatic, and the Soviets dejected, and the whole world watched at the edges of their seats as the race of the century came to a close. Fast forward, less than a year later, and NASA is still keen on sending astronauts to the moon. Apollo 11 was an incredible success, but scientists want to run more experiments on the moon rocks and discover more about its surface, something Armstrong and Aldrin have very little time to do. But there is a problem. No one is interested in space anymore. Americans were glued to their screen when the first Saturn V rocket launched, but now that it's been done, everyone moved on to more pressing matters. With the space race firmly over and the excitements of beating Soviet Union gone, flying to the moon is simply old news. The only ones who care are sadly NASA themselves. It's clear that the budget cuts will mean future journeys to the moon will be next to impossible. Luckily, 15 Saturn V rockets were commissioned during the 60s to complete the trip to the moon. meaning they had 9 left over for future expeditions. Americans are happy to see men back on the moon, but didn't think much else of the mission. The following year, NASA begins preparations for their third manned mission to the moon, Apollo 13. At this point, public interest is at an all-time low. The scientific community is excited by the prospect of conducting more in-depth geological experiments this time around. The rush to get to the moon and back left little time for science. Liftoff is scheduled for April 11, 1970. The Saturn V rocket is made up of 3 different parts. The command module serves as a crew's living quarters and where the men can pilot the ship. The service module is used for storage and contains essentials such as oxygen tanks and life support systems. Finally, the lunar module is a separate spacecraft that breaks away from the main rocket and allows the crews to land on the moon itself. The heads of NASA picked 3 men best suited for the job. Ken Mattingly, a well-experienced US Navy aeronaut turned astronaut, is tasked with piloting the command module. Fred Hayes, a former military pilot, is tasked with directing the lunar module. Overseeing the mission is Jim Lovell, an astronaut who's worked on Apollo 1 and Apollo 8 and the only one of the 3 who had been to space before. He's by far and away the most senior of the astronauts, being among the first men to travel and orbit the moon itself. The plan for Apollo 13 is simple as rocket science gets. After taking off from Earth, the rocket is meant to take them to the moon and back in 10 days. The crew train rigorously for the journey, committing 5 hours for training for every 1 hour they will spend in space. They even practice geological sampling exercises to gather as much information as possible for the scientists back home.
Our training is basically broken up into training on the simulator, which will give us the complete mission training of all the systems and the procedures of getting to the moon, of landing and coming back again, and also in the EVA, or the lunar exploration type work, which Fred Hayes and myself will do once we land.
Herein comes the use of a drill for the first time on the moon. It's a device to build, if you will, 2 10-foot holes. It does an extremely good job, even through the solid rock fragments that exist in that soil model.
With their journey laid out and their mission clear and all security checks are made, the Apollo 13 crew are ready to take to the stars. But even before takeoff, there is an issue. The command module pilot, Ken Mattingly, contracts measly only 4 days before launch. Luckily, NASA has a backup man ready to go in every position. Jack Swigert, an experienced USAF pilot, steps up to the plate. April 11th comes, and the 3 astronauts board the Saturn V rocket, ready for takeoff. At exactly 1913 GMT, Apollo 13 thrusters push the men into orbit and the mission begins. In 10 days' time, if all goes well, the crew will have landed in Fra Mauro and will have returned home without a scratch. But only 5.5 minutes into the 10-day mission, the crew feel a small, unusual vibration spread through the ship. The center engine of the S2 stage, the part of the Saturn V designed to propel the crew into orbit, shuts off 2 minutes early. This forces the other 4 engines to burn 34 seconds longer than normal, and the following SIVB third stage had to burn 9 seconds longer than planned. Such small complications are an omen of things to come. Apollo 13 is cursed right from the start. Still, NASA are no strangers to complications. Landing a man on the moon doesn't come without some trial and error, so the crew know how to respond should anything minor go wrong. The takeoff is an overall success, and the crew are well on their way to reach their destination on time. The first 2 days of the trip are largely uneventful. The 3 men maintain their stations, correct their course when needed, and keep in good health. They even set up cameras to show people back on Earth and how they're getting along. Most people don't bother changing the TV channels, however. It's mainly only the families of the men on board who tune in. The Apollo 13 mission is going smoothly. So smoothly, in fact, that the boredom starts to set in. 46 hours and 43 minutes into the journey, the capsule commander back on Earth, Joe Kerwin, jokes,
"The spacecraft's in real good shape as far as we're concerned, Jim. We're bored to tears down here."
Little does he know, he just tempted fate, and fate responds in kind. Just under 56 hours into the mission, Swigert flicks a switch to stir one of the oxygen tanks to get a better reading of the internal pressure. Soon after, the entire crew hears a loud bang, then a sound like a soda can being crumbled. The lights flicker for a second, and for the briefest moment, all communications with the NASA Control Center back on Earth is lost. When the comms are back online, Lovell says the now famous words over the radio.
"Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here."
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Shortly after, he looks out of one of the command module windows and sees something that sends a chill down his spine. What was minutes ago a smooth, boring, and controlled trip to the moon has turned into a moment of an utmost crisis. If the crew don't act soon, they'll all be dead, their bodies lost to the vast expanse of space forever. So begins the most dangerous and heart-racing challenge NASA has ever faced.
When you described the situation accurately in terms of hardware, how critical is this situation right now in your opinion?
Well, I think it is as critical, perhaps probably the most critical situation we've faced so far in the manned spaceflight program in flight.
When the loud bang first sounded around the ship, Commander Lovell believed it was another one of Hazy's practical jokes. Hazy's was a newcomer to space travel and had been pulling pranks on his colleagues by turning the pressurization valve in the lunar module, which created a sound very similar to one that they just all heard. But when Lovell turns and sees the stunned look on Hazy's face, he quickly understands this is no joke. Something has gone wrong. Still, NASA staff has become resident experts in handling last-minute complications, and it isn't as if this very same mission has gone off without a hitch. The crew figure out whatever problem they're facing is solvable and get in contact with the team back on Earth.
We have the situation stabilized now, we think. I think our only concern about safety is that we're now about 70 hours from home, and we have to continue to keep the situation that way and bring them on home.
The three men come together to find out what has happened. Initially, they theorize that a passing meteorite might have struck the lunar module. This is surprisingly unlikely, but not impossible. The men's training kicks in and they seal the hatch between the command module and lunar module to stop any flooding, as they believe the meteorite's impact might have caused a cabin leak. However, they soon realize that the cabin is perfectly intact. Warning lights blare overhead, and the crew turns to see that two of the three fuel cells, the hydrogen and the oxygen power reserves that gives the ship electricity, has been knocked out. This is bad news. Without power, the three astronauts can't communicate with the team on Earth, and their life support system will fail. They'll be stranded in the cold, dark beyond. It's at this moment that Lovell takes a look outside and realizes that the situation isn't just bad, it's catastrophic. He reports back to the NASA team on Earth and says that a gas of some sort is venting out of the ship into space. The crew looks at the oxygen tank readings and see all of the oxygen in tank number 2 is gone, and the oxygen tank in number 1, the last one left in the service module, is emptying fast. With their last oxygen reserves depleting rapidly, it's only a matter of time until the last fuel cell goes offline. This means the command module will be left with no power except for its own batteries and the last oxygen surge tank. The operators back on Earth tell the crew to seal the last tank to preserve what little oxygen they might have left. Either way, they're about to run out of the power or oxygen. Things are looking grim.
We're going on the secondary canister.
in the LEM any time now. The CO2 level is getting up near 15, and we'll have, I believe it's 8 hours.
Something happened to the fuel cells in the oxygen tank, and they were down in that area. It was a rather violent kind of thing because it apparently reset some of the check valves in the RCS quads, which are susceptible to shock. But as far as what exactly happened, I have no idea.
What exactly has happened? If we rewind back to the days of Apollo 10, we'll find our answer. When NASA were preparing for the Apollo 10 missions back in May of the previous year, the engineers had decided to refit all the oxygen tanks to function at 65 volts of power rather than 28. One of the oxygen tanks taken out of the Saturn V rocket meant for the Apollo 10 had been dropped during the extraction at the Kennedy Space Center. It was only a 2-inch drop, but to be absolutely sure, the engineers decided to have the tank replaced for the Apollo 10 mission. NASA's engineer inspected the tank's exterior after the mission and found that there had been no significant damage done, so decided it would be safe to use in the upcoming Apollo 13 journey. What they failed to notice was the damage done to the inside of the tank. One of the internal fill lines were left jarred, leading to the possible technical problems in the future. Not only that, an even more dangerous mistake had been made. When fitting all of the oxygen tanks, the team charged with updating all the components of the tank to operate at 65 volts forgot to change the heater thermostatic switches, the devices that cool down the tanks should they get too hot inside. The tanks usually operated at temperatures between -300 and -100 degrees Fahrenheit, and could reach an utmost temperature limit of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point the thermostatic switches would activate. As the ship is pumping 65 volts of energy into those switches for hours on end during the flight, they soon become overloaded and weld shut. The temperature inside the oxygen tank number 2, the one with the faulty internal fill line, rises and rises without any switch to help it cool down. At one point, the heat inside the tank reaches 1000 degrees Fahrenheit. As the temperature reading only goes up to 80 degrees, no one in the ship knows of the danger. This incredibly high heat burns away the Teflon insulation inside the tank, exposing some of the electrical wires connected to the power fans. Apollo 13 is flying with, in effect, a ticking time bomb inside the service module. When Swigert stirs the inside of the tanks as per routine, the exposed wires short circuit and catches fire. The fire leads to a rising temperature which builds and builds until it has only one way of escaping: an explosion. Tank number 2 bursts, blowing off the cover of bay number 4, exposing all of the tanks inside to the vacuum of space. Oxygen tank number 1 is also damaged, and its contents begin to spill out rapidly. Within the next 3 hours after the incident, all oxygen inside the tanks will be lost, meaning access to water, propulsion power, and electricity is severely hampered. Naturally, neither the Apollo 13 crew nor the scientists back on Earth know the exact details of what's going on. All they know is that they're losing oxygen fast and are running out of options. Lowell, Swigert, and Hayes are talking to the control center, trying to find ways to sort the problem out.
Flight, I've got a feeling we've lost 2 fuel cells. I hate to put it that way, but I don't know why we've lost them. It doesn't all tag up, and it's not an instrumentation problem, the best I can tell right now. Okay, I'll tell you what, let's discuss this for just a little bit longer there. Pressure in O2 tank 1 is all the way down to 297. We better think about getting in the LEM, or using the LEM systems.
Okay, 13, we verify that we want you to close down, shut down fuel cell 1, close the reaction valve.
Okay, Jack, it looks like O2 tank 1 pressure is just a hair over 200.
It's slowly going to 0, and we're starting to think about the LEM lifeboat.
Protocol dictates that entry into lunar orbit is strictly prohibited if any of the 3 fuel cells aren't operational. Considering Apollo 13 is about to lose all 3 in one go and are about to have no oxygen reserves left, the operator and NASA decided to abort the moon landing. From here on now, all efforts are squarely focused on bringing the 3 men back home, safe and sound. But how? The ship is still heading towards the moon, and all life support systems are failing. It will take a miracle to bring the ship, let alone the men still alive inside, back on Earth at all. Worse still, the explosion has damaged the propulsion system needed to make it direct back home to Earth. Luckily, NASA has the greatest asset of all on their side, the sharpest, most brilliant minds of their generation. The scientists and crew are quick on their feet and start putting together numbers of a potential plan. They cross many off their list, but find one that might just work. They decide to take the scenic route. The plan is that Apollo 13 will swing around the moon using the gravity of the orbit as momentum. Then it will course correct to track back to Earth. After that, the crew will hop into the lunar module and use their craft as kind of a lifeboat to return home. To say this is uncharted territory is putting it lightly. These plans are all made up on the fly, and a number of simulations are run in the control center to make sure it could even work. In true NASA spirit, the crew members joke around to stay in good spirits, but there's no denying the fact that they're in a do-or-die situation. One mistake, no matter how small, will spell their doom. But NASA has built its reputation of pulling off the impossible. Not even 1 year ago, fellow astronaut Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on a world many thought was forever out of reach. The crew put their heads together and focus while the team back on Earth works around the clock to bring their boys back home to their worried families. What comes next would either be NASA's darkest moment or its finest hour. While the Apollo 13 crew is readying to pull off the most daring spaceflight maneuver of all time, something strange is happening back home on Earth. The rest of the world has slowly caught wind of the incident, and many people's ears starts to stand up. As mentioned before, the vast majority of Americans weren't paying attention to the Apollo 13 mission. All they knew was that a few astronauts were on a routine mission to the moon and would be back in a few days' time. Maybe they'd see a few pretty photos in the newspaper, but that was as far as their interest went. But when the press starts telling stories of the 3 brave American heroes fighting for their lives in the vacuum of space, desperately trying to come back home against all odds, that grabs people's attention. Whether driven by morbid curiosity over how the story will end, or genuinely concerned over the men's health and safety, men and women all across the world starts turning into their radio stations and switches on the TV to catch the latest news on Apollo 13.
The flight of the Apollo 13 to the moon is in serious jeopardy this morning and is not going to make a moon landing. As the Apollo 13 was some 205,000 miles from Earth, speeding toward its rendezvous with the moon scheduled for tomorrow night, the fuel cells that supply it with electrical power suddenly failed. With this lack of power, the mission could not be completed to the moon, and it is now a question of getting the men home safely.
When the news reaches the White House, President Nixon takes a special interest in the fate of the 3 men. He cleared his schedule, phoned the crew members' families, then headed straight down to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland for a debrief from the NASA officials. Overnight, the Apollo 13 mission has gone from a boring run-of-the-mill NASA operation that only concerned the immediate families of those involved to a gripping 24-hour news story that has captured the nation's eye. The passionate fire for spaceflight exploration that once burned in the hearts of the millions of Americans is reignited. Congress even passes a resolution on April 14, one day after the accident, calling on all businesses to observe a moment of prayer for the employees at 9 p.m. It's not just Americans rooting for the astronauts either. Pope Paul VI led the congregation of over 10,000 people hoping for their safety, while a religious festival held in India sees 100,000 locals join together to pray for the men's swift and safe return. According to one of their simulations, NASA also estimates that the lunar module will splash down in the Indian Ocean, a part of the world where they don't have many operatives. The Soviet Union, Americans' bitter rival at the time, offers to redirect 4 ships in the vicinity to help pick up the men when they re-enter. Despite being one of the most hard-fought ideological battlegrounds of the Cold War, spaceflight has always been seen as a way of bringing humanity together to explore the deepest recesses of the unknown. The people of the world set their differences aside and work tirelessly in any way they can to bring the 3 men home. Apollo 13's odds might be slim, but they have all of Earth cheering them on. Back on the ship, the crew switches off the power to the command module, which is quickly losing oxygen, and pack themselves into the lunar module named Aquarius. The lunar module has a backup life support system that will keep them alive for longer than the failing command module. But there's a catch. Aquarius is only designed with enough backup systems to support 2 astronauts for 20 hours, not 3 for 4 to 5 days. The men maintain a tight rotation on food and water to keep themselves alive. The astronauts eat only 1/5 of their daily allowance and drink no more than 0.2 liters of water a day. After all, some of that water is needed for cooling down the lunar module's overworked systems. The rationing leaves the crew underfed and dehydrated, but it's better than being dead. The lack of water even leads to Hazy's contracting a nasty urinary tract infection. Once the ship enters the moon's orbit, they start looping around the body, using the momentum as a means of propelling themselves back towards Earth without using too much fuel. The engineers back on Earth run hundreds of tests, and they find they will need to use the lunar module's propulsion system to correct their trajectory. The move would save the astronauts 12 hours of travel, but it could save even more if they take a risky gamble. Some of the NASA scientists propose jettisoning the service module, which will bring the men home in just 4 days. The risk, however, is exposing the command module's heat shields to open space. They might not be able to withstand the temperature. In a situation where time is of the essence, every second counts. NASA's official decided to keep the original plan and stick with the 4-minute propulsion burn. It might be seen as a safer option when it comes to space travel emergencies. An extra second can mean the difference between life and death. The problem of the lunar module support system resurfaces. At first, the crew thinks of taking spare lithium hydroxide canisters, which are used to reduce carbon dioxide levels, from the command module and transferring them to the lunar module. But the command module canisters are square, whereas the lunar module's canisters are round. With carbon dioxide levels rising, the men have to think of a solution fast. This is when the true genius in the minds of NASA shines. Using nothing but spacesuit hoses, cardboard, spare plastic bags, and a hefty amount of duct tape, Mission Control directs the 3 astronauts to build a makeshift canister that can fit inside the Aquarius. They plug the canisters in, and the systems start filtering out carbon dioxide in the air. This isn't to say that the journey is comfortable, far from it. Inside Aquarius is a pitch black freezing cold, and there is next to no food or water to go around. The men crack a few jokes with Mission Control here and there, but there's no denying that the novelty of the situation and the bleak living conditions are starting to weigh on morale. Still, Lavelle, Swigert, and Hayes are men of science. Even in the darkest of times, they stop just to appreciate the beauty of our universe has to offer. As they swing by the moon, they peer out of the lunar module window and take some truly stunning photos. After a few long days of calculations, last-minute procedures, and next to no sleep, the Apollo 13 ship is nearing Earth. Mission Control tells the crew to fire up all the systems in the command module again. This is risky in and of itself, as no one knows for sure what the effects of restarting everything after such a long period will be. The scientists back on Earth would normally have 3 months to drum up such calculations. They pulled them off in just 3 days. The worry is that the built-up condensation inside the command module would cause a short-circuiting, which would result in a huge fire. The astronauts take the risk and follow through. Luckily, everything powered on just fine. At the very start of the Apollo space program, An accident during the testing of Apollo 1 caused a fire in the command module which killed all 3 men on board. Safety measures were installed. This cannot happen again. The crew aren't out of the woods yet. Another problem arises. Mission Control informs the men they'll need to burn the propulsion system yet again to correct their course. As the lunar module's guidance system has gone down, they have to look out of the window and use the line of the sun's light traveling across the Earth to eyeball it. This is the first time this technique has ever been used on a lunar expedition. The lunar module's propulsion system fired for 14 seconds, bringing the re-entry into Earth back on track. Next, the men jettison the service module. This is the first time they get a proper look of what happened inside, and they're stunned by the severity of the damage. 105 hours, 18 minutes and 42 seconds into the mission, and with just 3 hours left until re-entry into Earth atmosphere, both the Apollo 13 crew and the scientists of Mission Control are at the end of their tether. There's one final hurdle they need to clear before they're home free. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert move back into the command module. They need to jettison the lunar module before the splashdown. The service module gone, there's no safe, reliable way of doing this. Some last-minute calculations are made by a team of crack engineers at the University of Toronto to figure out just how much air pressure is needed to separate Aquarius from the command module. The crew detach the lunar module and hold their breath. It works. Inside the command module heading down to Earth, the 3 astronauts brace themselves as they prepare to re-entry. At Mission Control, the air is tense. This is a moment of truth. The command module cuts through the atmosphere. Suddenly, all communications with the ground of NASA is lost. This was anticipated. Re-entry typically causes a 4-minute blackout. From this point, the men are on their own until they fall into the Pacific Ocean. 1 minute passes. 2, 3, 4, 5. Now the scientists begin to worry. People look around, wondering why Apollo 13 isn't responding. Nerves are at an all-time high, and many wonder if the command module's heat shields gave in. It's possible the men were roasted alive inside upon re-entry. 6 minutes pass. A crack over the radio. Everyone at Mission Control looks up.
Okay, go.
The sound of Lovell's voice sends waves of ecstasy throughout the room. The ship has landed, and the USS Iwo Jima swings by to pick them up. Millions of Americans are watching at home, including among them the legendary Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin jump for joy upon seeing the men exit the command module. The crew are famished, dehydrated, and fatigued, but alive. They have done the impossible.
I'm just very thankful and very humble, and I want to thank everyone at Mission Control, all the men at Mission Control, for making it possible for my husband and his crew to return to Earth, and I want to thank all the people in the world who have sent us, all the people in the world who have sent us messages of concern and all their prayers that have been said for us, and we all have a great deal of faith in God, and this has really proven that it is true.
When Apollo 13 splashes down on Earth, the crew still thinks most Americans haven't been paying attention to their mission. It was only when they have landed in Honolulu, Hawaii, that they understand how much things have changed. They're overwhelmed by the packed crowds cheering their return, and can't believe that their names are in every newspaper across the city. President Nixon welcomes the men on stage and awards them the highest civilian honor there is, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Nixon goes on to say later that while meeting with the crew of Apollo 11 after splashdown was iconic, greeting the crew of Apollo 13 is the most exciting and meaningful day he's ever experienced. The technicians and scientists who worked tirelessly to bring the men are also awarded their own medals of freedom. Their work is credited as the NASA's finest hour. The story of Apollo 13 gripped the nation and rekindled a lost passion for NASA. It's a story that few who experienced it will ever forget. But just as excitement over the first moon landing eventually faded, so too did the interest in space evaporate months after Apollo 13. Americans watched the tale unfold on the edges of their seats, but now that it was over, they felt ready to return to their normal lives. But NASA never forgot the kindness and support the nations of the world showed them during the ordeal. When Apollo 15 returned to the moon on August 2, 1971, the crew placed a silver plaque and figurine of an astronaut on the surface. Fallen astronaut commemorates those who gave their lives to further understanding of space travel. It lists 14 names, among those the names of 6 Soviet astronauts. Despite the bitter rival between the two nations' governments, NASA decided to pay tribute to the country that had offered their helping hand during the most dire of times. And thanks to that, the names of the 3 great men were kept off the list: Jim Lovell, Jim Hayes, and Jack Swigert.